Okay, welcome to Book by Book. Tonight we're going to look at two chapters, and it's going to be First Kings 11 and 12. And so maybe a little shorter, maybe. There's a lot that happens in these two chapters. Last week we looked at Solomon and his accomplishments, and so this week we're going to start with Solomon on the decline and his um just everything that goes wrong for Solomon basically is what we're gonna do tonight. And then we're going to see his son and the kingdom start to separate. So that's where we're at this week. So I'm going to jump in with First Kings chapter 11. And all right. So King Solomon, however, loved many women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Not a good sign. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon had held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. Okay, so early on, we saw Solomon get married to Pharaoh's daughter, and that was our first red flag. Like, hey, you are making a political alliance with the nation from which you were delivered. Your people were delivered from slavery in Egypt, and now you're making an alliance with them. And that should have been a red flag for us. And as we look at all of the different nationalities that Solomon is marrying, the problem is not just an ethnic problem here. There's no reason for to think through this and say, well, this is surely a reason to not have marry people from different ethnicities. No, that's not the point. The point is these people are going to pull Solomon away from faithfulness to the Lord. And so that's the command, that the reason for those commands in the Old Testament. Because we do see in the story of Ruth, Ruth was a Moabite, and she committed herself to the Lord as she was cleaving to Naomi. And so she fully submitted and surrendered to Yahweh. And so she's a different ethnicity that is marrying into the tribe of Israel. So it's not an ethnic problem that is the reason, it's a religious problem. And so part of these numbers that we're looking at here as well is like, it says he loved them, but there are 700 wives and 300 concubines. And so how one person can love that many people, I don't know. But the love is definitely a tied to his heart. Like his heart is tied to these people in some way. And so he it says he held fast to them in love, and his wives turned his heart after other gods. And so right away, we should note this is not a good sign for Solomon. And we start to see what this looks like as he is lifting up these different gods, Ashtoreth, Molech, and then we'll see Chemosh in the next paragraph as well. But all of these different gods are part of the Canaanite religions of the region, and the detestable practices included child sacrifice, included sexual perversion in their worship rites. All of these things were a part of what was happening among the Canaanites, and this is part of the reason why the Lord said, "You must drive them from the land," because they are corrupting the land with their practices. And so we are given a contrast here as well, because Solomon is not following after the Lord the way David followed after the Lord. And so when we think about a man after God's own heart, as David is often called, one of the things that we should recognize is that, yes, David was imperfect. He was a man of war and violence. He had sexual sin in his life. So how is he a man after God's own heart compared to Solomon? And in this instance, what we should notice is David only ever worshiped the Lord. He never turned after other gods. And so when we think about the kings so far, we've had Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul never really seemed fully committed to the Lord. As we see, he didn't follow God's commands about making the sacrifices, waiting for Samuel to arrive. He seemed to be more focused on what the people would think of him, and he instead of fearing the Lord, he feared public opinion, and so his heart wasn't fully after the Lord. David, and all his faults, never turned away from Yahweh, and now here we have Solomon, third king in Israel, and already he is following after other gods. And the reason is because of all these different wives. And again, the wives part of it is, in the law allows for, in the Old Testament, allows for polygamy, but it does not like condone it, like saying like, this is a really good idea. And so the wives that he has, these are most likely starting off as political alliances. And so the 700 royal wives are political alliances, and then the 300 concubines are not like a full royal status for a partner, but it is somebody that it may still have some kind of alliance with a tribe in the region or something like that. But they're not on the same level. All right, so Solomon's a mess. So he's starting to follow after other gods and not walking in the way as his father David had done. Verse 7, on a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant with my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of your the hand of your son, yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So he is, so he's following after other gods. He is building places for his wives to worship other gods within view of Jerusalem, within view of the temple. And so we see Solomon build this temple, and God fills it and with his glory, and like his name chooses to let his name dwell there, and it's so good and so wonderful. But then he's also building all of these other places of worship where they can do these detestable practices. And so he is, for being the wisest man, he's a real idiot. I mean, there's no real way around it. And here the Lord, now he spoke to him twice already, saying, I will be with you if you follow after me the way your father David did. And so now the Lord comes to him again and says, hey, you are not doing what you said you would do. So now the kingdom will be taken away. And part of what we should remember is when David took advantage of Bathsheba and had Uriah killed, the Lord said to David through the prophet Nathan, the sword will never leave your house. And so there's already a promise of conflict for David's family. And now the kingdom is going to be greatly diminished for the Davidic dynasty. But Solomon, it won't happen when Solomon's still alive, because God made a promise to David. And that's something that I think is important to remember. Like, God's promises, God keeps them. But we also have a responsibility to continue to walk in the ways of God. And so Solomon is showing that, even the wisest man can be really dumb. And a divided heart will lead to a divided kingdom. It's not just that Solomon was doing this, because ultimately, if the king is doing this, then it will work its way into the whole kingdom, as you are giving these permissions for these different idolatries and corrupt practices. So Solomon is, after all these great things, now we start seeing more bad things happen. And so in verse 14, it picks up, then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary. Now that word for adversary is an interesting word in Hebrew, because it is Satan. So when we read Satan in the book of Job, that's the accuser, the adversary. And so here we have a person who is taking the role of the adversary, Hasatan. So this person is Hadad, the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. Earlier, when David was fighting with Edom, Joab, the commander of the army who had gone up to bury the dead, had struck down all the men in Edom. Joab and all the Israelites stayed there for 6 months until they had destroyed all the men in Edom. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. They set out from Midian and went to Paran. Then, taking people from Paran with them, they went to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food. And so Hadad is kind of a political refugee as after this conflict with David. And so Joab is eliminating the men in the power structures of Edom, which is not an uncommon thing to do in ancient warfare. And so he has these officials who spare his life, basically. It's not unlike when Mary and Joseph have that vision from the angel to say, hey, Herod's going to kill all the boys under age 2, and they run to Egypt. It's a similar kind of situation where get out of the kingdom to save an important person's life. And so he is growing up in Egypt, and Pharaoh is taking care of him and providing for him and all this. Verse 19, Pharaoh was so pleased with Hadad that he gave him a sister of his own wife, Queen Tahpenes, in marriage. The sister of Tahpenes bore him a son named Gunabath, whom Tahpenes brought up in the royal palace. There, Genubath lived with Pharaoh's own children. While he was in Egypt, Hadad heard that David rested with his ancestors and that Joab, the commander of the army, was also dead. Then Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me go, that I may return to my own country." "What have you lacked here that you want to go back to your own country?" Pharaoh asked. "Nothing," Hadad replied, "but do let me go." And so here's one of his adversaries, and we see he was hiding out in Egypt until David died. And so this may be an event that happened closer to when Solomon actually ascended to the throne. Hadad came back to Edom and started being a problem for Solomon from Edom. And so we don't really get a picture of what that conflict looks like. But we just see he's an adversary. He's somebody who is going to be running contra to Solomon's purposes. And Edom is going to be a problem for the nation of Israel for a long time. And even when they are ultimately carried off into Babylon, the Edomites are going to be cheering on the Babylonians, saying, "Yeah, get them," and waiting for them to all be taken so they can go in and fill the land. And there's an ancient tension here because the Edomites are descendants of Esau. And so Jacob and Esau are brothers who Jacob tricked Esau into selling his birthright, and then tricked Isaac into blessing Jacob instead of Esau. And so there's that tension that's a part of their family history. And so the land that they are in that the Israelites are in, there might be some sense of own like I want to say ownership, but like the Edomites believe that that should be theirs anyway, because their ancestor was the firstborn. And so, yeah, so he's going to be an adversary. Verse 23, God raised up against Solomon another adversary. Again, that's Hasatan, Rezon, son of Elida, who had fled from his master Hadadezer, king of Zobah. When David destroyed Zobah's army, Rezon gathered a band of men around him and became their leader. They went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon ruled in Aram and was hostile towards Israel. And so Edom is on the southeast part of Israel, and then Damascus is on the north end of Israel. And so Solomon has these two, I'm kind of trying to get in the frame here, these two conflict points on the north end and the south end of the nation. And so what that trouble looks like, it could be raiding parties, it could be, just skirmishes on the borderlands. Those kinds of things could be a part of it. Just a resistance fighter against Solomon. Yeah. And so Solomon, like, we see him not like actively going to war with people during his reign, but there is conflict here. And so all of this is going on. And then we also see another person who's going to rebel against Solomon. And so all of this we're being told at this point in the narrative, because the writer is like, look, Solomon did all these good things, but also there were some things that we should note that Solomon, where he dropped the ball, where he failed. And so verse 26 picks up with the, I think, most important one. Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeradah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. All right, so Jerusalem, it was built by the Jebusites, and they built it on these different posts, pillars. And so Solomon then kind of filled them in and built these terraces to fill in the land a bit, and then also repaired the wall around Jerusalem. And so Jeroboam was a worker, and he was really good. And so he elevated him, he promoted him. And so he's overseeing the labor force. And if we remember, a couple weeks ago, Solomon had different labor force practices. And so the Canaanites that were still in the land, Solomon conscripted them into forced labor. And then there were some rotating laborers as part of the Israelites that would spend a month on and then have 2 months off, kind of working through quarters kind of thing. And so Jeroboam is probably the overseer of that kind, because they're from the tribes of Joseph. So he wasn't overseeing the slaves, but he was overseeing Israelites from the tribe of Joseph who were probably not really wanting to do this work. They'd rather work on their farms or with their flocks, all that. And so about this time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem. So he's finishing up his work, going home. And Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as Solomon's father did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him a ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose, and who obeyed my commands and decrees. I will take the kingdom from his son's hand and give you 10 tribes. I will give one tribe to his son, so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you and walk in obedience to me and do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands, as David, my servant, did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. So Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak, the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death. So Jeroboam, going home, has an encounter with a prophet. Now, we have seen three prophets, really. There is Samuel. He's a big deal. And then we have Nathan and Gad. Those are the three main prophets that we've been interacting with. The Lord speaks directly to Solomon, but he speaks through the prophets to Saul and David. And so now here we have another prophetic appointment of a new king. And so for each dynasty, there has been a prophetic appointment. So Saul was appointed by Samuel, David was appointed by Samuel, and now as Solomon has failed the Lord's ways, Abijah comes and he is appointing Jeroboam. And the symbolism here is significant as well. And this is where we start to see the prophetic role in the Old Testament start to take on these displays as they are trying to communicate God's truth. And so he takes this new cloak and rips it into 12 pieces, and Jeroboam gets 10 of those. And so, this is all to try to visualize what God is doing and trying to help Jeroboam see what is going on. Part of the key here that we should note is, again, it is not Solomon's goodness that is making this endure. It is God's promise to David that he would always have a son in Jerusalem, where God chose to let his name and his glory dwell. And so Solomon is really just hanging out now. He's not the main part of God's redemptive plan anymore, as much as his promise to David is. And so the promise then that the Lord is making through Abijah to Jeroboam is very similar to the promise to David. He's saying, I'm going to set up a new dynasty through you with the 10 tribes that you will be taking from Solomon's descendant. And all of the same things. If you walk in my ways, if you are like David, then I will be with you and your dynasty will endure. Now, spoiler alert, Jeroboam's not going to do any of that. He's terrible. He's awful. So that's something to keep in mind. The same kind of promise that God made to David, to Solomon, makes to Jeroboam. Jeroboam will do even worse. And so when Solomon hears about it, he's like, I got to get rid of this Jeroboam dude. So he tries to kill him. But again, this guy goes to Egypt. And so he waits out Solomon's lifetime down there. And so in verse 41, we just pick up the end of Solomon's reign. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. And so the Annals of Solomon is a book we don't have access to. It's gone. But we will get those references throughout the books of Kings and Chronicles. Are these not written in the Annals of the Kings of Israel? Are these not written in the Annals of the Kings of Judah? And so there's going to be those references. We just don't have those books anymore. But I think it's important to recognize that there is a larger tradition of history that the writer of First and Second Kings and the writers of the Book of Chronicles, they're drawing from this larger history as well. And so, so someday it would be rad if we had another like Dead Sea Scrolls kind of situation where we found some of these scrolls of the annals of the kings of Solomon or something like that. That'd be awesome. But yeah, we don't have them. They're gone. So he dies. We're not told how he died. He just dies. And so we don't even get his last words, which I think is interesting. He's so wise and so important for like establishing the size of Jerusalem, building the temple, all these things. He just dies. Yeah, he's just gone. So Rehoboam takes over, and in verse 1 of chapter 12, we read this: Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. So when he came to the throne, in David, when he was king, he was made king in Hebron and then reaffirmed in Jerusalem for all of Israel. And so Rehoboam goes to Shechem, which is interesting. He didn't go to Hebron, which is part of Judah and like his hometown. Jerusalem, it wasn't the place to do this. Shechem is north, and it's a significant place for the people of Israel. It's where Joshua, he renewed the covenant with the people in chapter 24 of Joshua. It's also where Joseph's bones are buried in Genesis 50. And it's a place where we see in the book of Judges, one of the judges tries to make himself king in chapter 8. And so Shechem is this place that has some significance for the people of Israel for all these different reasons. And so we're not really sure why he chose that place, but we can look at what else happened in Shechem and say, all right, there might be some significance to that. And maybe going north, he's trying to consolidate a little bit more. Just say like, look, I know we've been doing everything down in Judah, and I want to like be a bigger part of the kingdom and involve northern tribes a little bit more. And so maybe that's why he did that. So he goes up to Shechem for all of Israel to make him king. And so there's probably this big tent, like a bunch of folks camping out and having a celebratory time. So when Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, they being the people of Israel, probably the folks from Ephraim, which is his tribe. They sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Now, who would know that the yoke was so heavy? Jeroboam, the guy who was in charge of the work teams. Like he knew that what Solomon was demanding of the people. And so he's coming from firsthand experience. It's kind of like, a story of like somebody who, is working in a coal mine and they're trying to unionize. It's that kind of thing. Like he's like, hey, this is not right, the way you're treating your workers. And we want some relief here. And so Rehoboam answered, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people? He asked. They replied, today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer. They will always be your servants. Sounds nice and supportive and encouraging. But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders that they gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He asked them, what is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? The young men who had grown up with him replied, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So two very different tacks of leadership and management here and motivation. And so the older men are telling him, like, look, you have an opportunity to be generous right now, to humble yourself, to serve them by lightening the load. Like what Solomon did was huge, and no organization, whether it's a company, a church, a family, or a nation, can really run full tilt all the time. Slow it down a little bit. And these people will appreciate that, and they'll be with you if you would just recognize their concern. But he rejects it, and these young guys who probably have something to prove feel like maybe these old guys, they're just in the way, they're slowing us down. We need to go achieve. They're trying to really build their own name. They say ramp it up, make the yoke heavier. Instead of scourging with whips, say you're going to scourge them with scorpions. So I don't even know how you do that, because scorpions aren't that big. But then the other piece here that is like scandalous. The Bible is full of scandal. There are scandalous things, and this is one of those scandalous lines. To say my little finger is thicker than my father's waist he's not talking about his pinky. What he's talking about, he's saying like my manhood is bigger than my father's waist here. Like I'm the man now, is what he's getting at. And so the writers of scripture use euphemisms like these to kind of soften down, and translators try to soften it down too. But this is it's a vulgar thing that they're recommending that Rehoboam say to the people. And so, these folks probably made Rehoboam feel like, yeah, I'm important, I'm strong. And so he went with their advice. So verse 12, 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, and the king, as the king had said, come back to me in 3 days. The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, my father made your yoke heavy, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. So one of the interesting things here, as we think about what is going on, the Lord has already told Jeroboam, like, the kingdom will be taken from Solomon's son. But Rehoboam still is presented an option. He's presented a choice. And so sometimes people read through scripture and they see God as being very deterministic, and say, like, it almost reads like he is making all these things happen. There are no options. But we're told in the story, Rehoboam had an option, but the Lord knew what Rehoboam would do. Rehoboam still had to make that choice. And so I think that's important to note. And so all of these things are happening. The Lord knew all of this was going to happen. And so when Ahijah spoke to Jeroboam, the Lord had already seen the beginning from the end on this. And so verse 16, when all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? Your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. And so this claim, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? That is an echo from earlier in the life of David, when the northern kingdoms didn't want to come back to be a part of David's kingdom after Absalom's rebellion. And so here that is coming up again. It seems like David and his descendants only care about themselves. What share do we have? And so to say, go back to your tents, Israel, is like, abandon David. And they say, look after yourself. You're on your own now, David. You're not the boss of us anymore. And so they leave. But the Israelites living in Judah, Rehoboam maintains those. But then we also will see that Benjamin essentially gets absorbed into Judah. So those are the two tribes that the house of David will continue to rule over. But Rehoboam is maybe trying to smooth things over here in the next section, verse 18. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of the forced labor. So Jeroboam's old job. But all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. That to this day is an interesting thing here as well, because that's an indicator that the writer that is compiling this part of the narrative right now is writing this sometime after the events of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. but highlighting that, it's not just that they're their own kingdom, they are in rebellion against the house of David. They're antagonistic to the house of David. So when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. So the Israelites are like, yeah, we love this Jeroboam guy. He's our advocate. We want him to be king. And Rehoboam just barely got out of there alive. His, what's his name? Adoniram got stoned because the people were so mad. And so verse 21, when Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered all Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 able young men, to go to war against Israel and to regain the kingdoms for Rehoboam, son of Solomon. But this word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. Say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord says. Do not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. So they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home again, as the Lord had ordered. So within one chapter, we're introduced to two different prophets, which is amazing. We have Shemaiah and Abijah. And so both of these prophets are reminding the people that God is orchestrating and over the events of their country. And whether or not Rehoboam thinks he can do this and overcome these tribes, the Lord is saying, no, I don't want you to do that at all. And the real miracle here is that they listened. Like they okay, we're not going to go fight. But there will be seasons of warfare between the northern kingdoms or the northern tribes and the southern tribes in the future. But right now, it is not going to happen. And so what is Jeroboam up to then? What is he going to do? And that's the last section that we'll look at tonight here in verse 25. Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there, he went out and built up Peniel. Jeroboam, so Shechem is the first capital of the northern kingdoms. And, this is where Rehoboam wanted to go and make himself king. And instead, Jeroboam is going to rule there. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David if these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. They will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. So Rehoboam, Jeroboam, this is part of his a wise thing, like just politically. He recognized if people have to continue going back to Jerusalem to make sacrifices, then in all likelihood, they will probably go back to following with Rehoboam, letting him be king, and they'll turn against me. And so I'm going to make some concessions for them so that they will remain loyal to me and keep them out of the southern kingdoms. And so he built these 2 worship centers here at Bethel and Dan. And so Bethel is on the south end, on the border, close to the border with Judah, and then Dan is the north end. And so people from both north and south have 2 options to go to. And he sells them on this really well. He said, it's too hard for you to go all the way to Jerusalem. So let me help you. Let me give you a better option. Let me give you a man-made idea on how to worship the Lord faithfully and conveniently. And so he sets these 2 altars up. And at these places, there are these golden calves. And as I was reading through this, there was all kinds of folks who are making claims that, Jeroboam's getting a bad rap because he didn't intend people to worship these things. But the text says, here are your gods. And so he is, instead of being faithful to Yahweh and not having an idol to worship, he makes two idols and tells them that these are your gods. Now, this should be something, as we're reading the story, like red flag, like alarm should be going off, because we have another story in the book of Exodus where Aaron, he is pressured by the people of Israel to, as Moses is up on the mountain, and they're like, we don't know if he's ever going to come back, make us some gods to worship. And so Aaron was like, give me your gold. And so they give him his gold, they give him gold, and he makes an idol, a golden calf. And the people start worshiping it, and it goes crazy and it goes bad. And so Aaron did that. And here, when he's confronted, Aaron says, I put the gold in and out came these calves. I don't know how it happened. Here, Jeroboam is like, he's owning it. Like, no, I made these for you. These are your gods. These gods brought you up out of Egypt. Everything contra to the story of Exodus. And so Jeroboam is setting up a completely different redemption history that will remove the people from covenant faithfulness, like right away. It's his first thing. The promise that God made to Jeroboam is, if you follow after me and walk in my ways as my servant David did, then I will create a dynasty for you, like I promised my servant David. And so right away, he's like, nah, I'm going to do my own thing. I want to control power. I want to consolidate power. I want to consolidate worship. I want to make sure that people don't go back to Jerusalem so that I can build my own kingdom. And so instead of trusting God, Jeroboam makes these decisions to try to protect himself. So the other interesting thing in this, it says this thing became a sin. People came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. And so there was like a circuit that they would worship. And so instead of going to one place, which would be easier, they go to two. And so even in their attempt to, Jeroboam's attempt to simplify worship for them, they still are making it more complicated. So yeah, it is, it's crazy what he's doing. But that's not it. But wait, there's more. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. So now all the high places all over Jerusalem, these hilltops, where they believe there's like a thin place where they could commune with the gods, and this was a part of the Canaanite practices. And so they would go up to these high places and they would offer sacrifices. They might engage in sexual immorality as a part of these different worship practices. All kinds of different things were happening on these high places. Jeroboam built all these shrines all over the place, and he appointed priests from all the people. So the Levites were supposed to be the only priests for the people of Israel. Now anybody can be a priest. Doesn't matter what tribe you're from. But there's more. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel, he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. So this festival is a counter festival to tabernacles. And so in the fall, the 7th month for the people of Israel, this is when they would come and do the Day of Atonement, Feast of Trumpets, Feast of Tabernacles. These are all in the same time frame. And so instead of those, now Jeroboam is saying, no, we've got a different festival on the 8th month. And this is the good one. This is the one that you're going to do. So it's a month of his own choosing. We have no idea what the purpose of this festival was. It doesn't tell us that. It's just, we're going to have our own thing. But at that festival, he is instituting all of these corrupt religious practices. And so Jeroboam, right away, way worse than Solomon, way worse than Rehoboam, and falling away from the Lord and his commands very, very quickly. And so Jeroboam coming up out of Egypt, he's kind of a reverse Moses. And he's also a reverse Aaron as he's setting up this new priesthood. And he is a reverse David as he is not walking in the ways of the Lord. And so Jeroboam is a mess. And so here is the real drama for the rest of the book of Kings is the conflict that will be in place because of the fracturing of the kingdom and the loss of corporate identity in the covenant with Yahweh. And so the northern kingdom is going to have their own problems with this, and then the southern kingdom is going to have a whole other set of problems with their corporate identity. There really are no good kings in the northern kingdom. They're just a series of bad kings, and the southern kingdom has some good, some bad. But this is this is really the rest of First and Second Kings. This is the conflict: is bad leadership and lack of faith in the Lord. So, and then also, this is where we're going to see. Sorry, I had some notes here at the end. This is where we're going to see the prophetic movement start to really take shape. We're going to encounter Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah. All of these prophets are going to start showing up in the historical books. And so they are going to be interacting with the events of history in the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, and bringing correction to that. And so we will read, we're going to walk through the historical books, and then we'll come back, down the road someday. We'll come back and hit the different prophetic books on their own instead of trying to like splice in the prophets as we go through the historical books. Because I want to get the narrative first, and then we'll come back and hit them all eventually. So, so let's stop there. Any questions or things you may have noticed in these two chapters of First and Second Kings?
I'm a little confused about how Solomon received the message from the Lord in chapter 11, verse 9. He gives this message, but then later we also see the message being given to Jeroboam.
Mm-hmm.
So did God directly tell Solomon, or did he hear about it after Jeroboam was told?
I think what we see in verse 9 is the Lord speaking directly to Solomon. And so, and this is the trend with the Lord's interactions with Solomon. In the two previous encounters, the Lord spoke to him. He didn't speak through a mediator of a prophet. He spoke to Solomon. And so then when Jeroboam is given the message to Ahijah, or through Ahijah, we don't really know how Solomon heard this word. It's because it just goes from Ahijah's message to verse 40. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt. And so somehow word got back to to Solomon about Jeroboam. I don't know if Jeroboam maybe tried to start up a bit of a movement. We don't really know. But yeah, we just have this. Somehow he found out. I do think that, if you're a king and you know that the Lord is taking your kingdom away, you're probably going to be on heightened alert too. And so any leader who starts to get more prominence becomes a threat. And so he could have just seen like Jeroboam becoming even more and more popular among people, and recognizing like, oh, people really like this Jeroboam guy. I got to get rid of him. So, which is part of what happened with Saul. Saul knew the kingdom was going to be taken away, and the Lord had put his spirit on somebody else. And it seemed like David was having all this success and people really loved him. And so Solomon could be more like Saul here at the end of his reign, to recognize like he's falling into that selfishness, that fear, and paranoia that could be part of what's going on there. Yeah, good question though.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right, great. Nailed it, everybody. Okay. Well then let's go ahead and wrap up for the night. I see you're all here, so I'm assuming you have power, so I'm glad you're okay. And yeah, y'all be safe, stay warm, and we will be back together next week. Lord willing, and the creeks don't rise, we'll have church on Sunday. So yeah, so I'll see you Sunday. If not, I'll see you Wednesday. So talk to y'all later.
All right. Have a good night, guys.
Night.